Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our viewers. Welcome to this productivity talk by the Asian Productivity Organization. I'm Gözde Bosnalı from the APO Secretariat and today's moderator. The APO is an international organization committed to improving productivity in the Asia-Pacific region. The APO P-Talks are a platform where innovative ideas for productivity enhancement are addressed by experts, practitioners, and academics. Before we start, I would like to thank our viewers for following us. To learn about upcoming P-Talks, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can leave your comments and questions in the chat box, and we will answer them after the session. Disability inclusion and neurodiversity have gained significant attention in recent years as organizations recognize the value of diverse perspectives and talents. Embracing these principles not only fosters a more equitable workplace, but also unlocks untapped potential, driving creativity and problem solving. Today's P-Talk explores the challenges and opportunities of fostering disability inclusion and neurodiversity in the workplace, showcasing how inclusive practices drive innovation, enhance productivity, and fuel business success. We will have an insightful discussion on practical strategies for building an inclusive work environment to enhance productivity and diversity in businesses. Welcome to our studio, Mrs. Coe. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be with you today.
Thank you so much. So before we start, let me share a little of your background with our viewers. Mrs. Sue is currently based in the UK, and she is a highly motivated international development and disability inclusion professional. She has substantial experience in general and disability inclusive development and humanitarian programming gained over 36 years. She is experienced in a range of technical sectors, including livelihoods, water, sanitation and hygiene, civil society empowerment, education, health, and advocacy. She has successfully delivered 140 consultancy assignments for more than 45 organizations since 2011. Before that, she worked in a number of large international NGOs on livelihoods, disability inclusion, and appropriate technology programs across Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. She also worked at a deaf charity in the UK for 2 years, managing their sign language training program. Mrs. Sue, I'm very eager to learn more from you about today's topic, and I know our viewers are too. Can you please your presentation?
Thank you very much, and thank you again for inviting me to do this presentation today on such an important topic. So I'm going to be talking to you today about unlocking business potential through neurodiversity and disability inclusion. So the first thing to think about is, why should businesses think about addressing disability inclusion? It's often a subject that people might just have one idea or two ideas about, but actually there's many, many different reasons for you to think about addressing disability inclusion in your company work. First of all, and I will touch on this in a little while, people with disabilities have the right to work and participate fully in all aspects of life on an equal basis with others. I'm going to explain a little bit about the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but it's very much that we all have a right to work and participate in our societies. Then a really important aspect for businesses to think about is that there's many valuable skills, experience and perspectives that people with disabilities of different impairment types can bring to companies as both employees and managers, and help increase company productivity. One of the things that often surprises me is that many statistics, when they're looked at according to a process that assesses different impairment types in any country, assesses that 15% of any population on average contains people with disabilities. And so when you think about that, that's a big market segment for companies to think about as well. Numbers of people with disability are increasing a lot as populations age, and also with medical advances, reducing mortality rates of conditions that previously would ended the life of many people. So a fourth reason to think about it is that making products and services accessible and inclusive can broaden your customer base. It can also get people to think about innovative product and service design. There's a lot of creativity in the IT sector, for example, thinking about accessibility and inclusion that benefits many people, all people with and without impairments. And finally, a reason, there will be others, but including people in with disabilities in a company's operations can improve your brand reputation. It can improve overall staff well-being, bearing in mind that many disabilities are invisible. So there will be people with disabilities in most companies, probably in all companies, but they may not have declared them. Those disabilities may not be visible. It can also minimise your legal and operational risks as more countries bring in legislation and standards and requirements and improve sustainability of what you're doing overall. So before I go into some practical ideas about how to do this in companies, I would just like to explain what is disability, which may be a strange question if it's something you've never thought about. But the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is based on that model at the bottom of this screen now, the social human rights model. So traditionally, many people think about disability in a way that how are people either brought into society by just medical approaches, which is what the medical model that you'll see on the screen in the top left addresses, or there's an assumption that people with disabilities only require long-term welfare benefits and therefore aren't able to work. And that is represented by the charity model. In the social human rights model, in the middle here at the bottom, you'll see that persons with disabilities are part of society. And I've already mentioned that data shows that on average, about 15% of any population in any country in the world has an impairment. So under this model, what you think about is what stops people with disabilities participating in their societies. And the focus is very much not just thinking on long-term welfare support or just medical support, but how can we identify and eliminate the different barriers which are access barriers? For example, people couldn't get into a shop if they are in a wheelchair and there's steps up to that shop. That is an access barrier. There are institutional barriers, which are some of the policies and laws and cultures that people hold that prevent people with disabilities participating. And the biggest barrier that people with disabilities often say is that the attitudes, the stigma and the discrimination that is often placed on people with disabilities, the assumptions that are made that they can't work, that excludes them from education, from employment, from many other aspects of life. So the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has this understanding of the social model, thinking about how do all of us think about the barriers that should be removed so people with disabilities can participate fully in society. And the key thing to say about this, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, is that every country in APO have ratified this convention, which means that your government has signed up and ratified that they will deliver all the different articles of that convention, which I recommend you to read if you have an opportunity to. It's very user-friendly. And under this model, activities focus on inclusion, recognising that people with disabilities are a normal and significant part of all societies. And an easy way I often think of people to summarize the differences is often people think of, in this basic equation here, people often think that disability is impairments, but actually what creates the disability is the barriers that are introduced for people and placed on people. So impairment plus barriers is disability. So it's important to recognise that people with disabilities are part of our societies, every society, and not separate. And to focus activities on identifying and removing the access barriers, which I've mentioned. Another example is if you are a deaf person and there's not a way to communicate with someone who is hearing, that is an access barrier as well. There's a need for communication support, sign language interpreter. The attitude barriers, which I mentioned, tend to be the biggest barriers. And then also the institutional laws, policies and cultures that block inclusion. And there is a very specific article in the Convention that addresses work and employment. And I would refer you to looking at that. It's only about a page long, but here's a quote from it, that persons with disabilities have the equal right to gain a living in labour markets and work environments that are open, inclusive and accessible. So what does this mean in terms of being a disability inclusive company? So I was part of a group that worked on a guide for the global company sector, for companies to think about in any countries. And we identified it down to one key approach and 4 key elements. Often people might just think there's only one element that needs to be thought about. But what I'm just going to take you through in this presentation is this key approach and these 4 key elements. So in summary, you'll see on this screen, the summary key approach is engagement and assessment with people with disabilities. And then the 4 components to think about, the 4 key elements, are leadership and governance, policies and procedures, training, and budgeting. And I'm going to talk about each of those ones in a little more detail now. So let's start with the key approach, engagement and assessment. The summary here is I would advise you to consult and involve people with disabilities directly, not to make assumptions, but to actually see that people with disabilities are employees of companies, customers and service users. So engaging with people with disabilities helps build a mutual understanding between company staff and people with disabilities themselves. The second thing to think about is regular engagement. It's not a one-off task for a one-off time, but like any customer review and feedback, it's part of the same thought process. So regular engagement helps assess and review your progress. For example, the accessibility of your operations, products and services, perhaps co-designing a disability inclusion policy for your company, and also to provide training. It's good practice if you're providing training on disability awareness to engage people with disabilities as part of the training delivery, ideally to lead it. So people are often not quite sure how to engage people directly and what are the different channels available. So I've listed 4 here for you to think about. Firstly, organisations of persons with disabilities. Now, these are known as OPDs. Some of you who might have been familiar with this previously might know them as DPOs, but they're now known commonly as OPDs. The key thing about this is these are organisations that are representative and managed by persons with disabilities. And there are OPDs in every country. So there are places that you can go to establish more. I'm going to give some resources at the end of the presentation to give you some clues about where you could go. Secondly, many countries now have national business and disability networks, And they're a great place for networking, sharing experiences in your own context, getting ideas, getting connections. Thirdly is direct engagement with persons with disabilities themselves, as customers, as employees, as service users. But there may be other forums for disability inclusion that exist in your country, and I would encourage you to think about and research where they may be. So let's go to the 4 elements. And this is something that I've learned through working in this sector for about 20 to 23 years directly now, that these 4 elements together can bring huge change. So the first thing to say is senior level support is crucially important. People need to feel both mandate and permission that they can invest the time and energies to thinking about disability inclusion in the company. So it helps also create a culture. And one very effective measure is having a senior level staff member as a disability champion. So that can be really helpful to enable commitments that a company might make to actually translate into ongoing practical interest and action. Because one of the biggest challenges is that commitments stay on paper and not translated into reality, even if a policy has been designed. So having a disability champion that reports to senior leadership and gives an interest and overview can really make a difference. Mandatory reporting also can really help on disability inclusion to the company board, because it then helps embed that commitment. Sometimes leadership can change in companies. People come into jobs, people leave jobs. But embedding regular reporting to the board helps embed this commitment at a senior level. So that's the first core element. The second core element is policies and procedures. And this is often an early starting point, which gives a roadmap and a guidance of setting and describing the expectations for all company staff on disability inclusion. So this can contain many different things, but I've given a list here of some common ones, and some of them are quite key as well. So these policies and procedures are important to guide staff and should include commitments and actions for, firstly, disability inclusion legislation that requires compliance in your country. So this might include anti-discrimination laws. Some countries have quota regulations where they require a certain percentage of staff to be people with disabilities. Many countries now have accessibility regulations about standards for your building and access, toilets, refreshment areas. It might be different things. Things like rehabilitation and return to work. So if people have had to have lengthy time off work through sickness or acquiring a disability, the process for their rights to return to work. So secondly, disability accessibility. So the measures for both how your employees work and also your products and how you operate. Policies can be really helpful for promoting the inclusion of people with disabilities as equal and valued employees, customers, and service users. And then importantly, it can also help prevent discrimination. It is very common, sadly, that many people with disabilities face in most countries, I think every country I've ever encountered, a form of exploitation, abuse, harassment, sometimes even violence. But having a policy that talks about prevention and response to that will really help. And then finally, how you will measure and report on disability inclusion to the company senior management that was mentioned in core element 1. So one common thing that often happens is people focus on this issue of compliance in the first point. What I often encourage people to is, with your company culture, if your values are to value people, to value your customers, go for best practice, not just minimum legal compliance. It says something about your company and your brand that will be really well responded to. The third key element is budgeting. It's an area that's often forgotten. Some areas will require funding, not necessarily as much as people often assume, but disability inclusion does require some budgeting. The two key areas I would encourage you to think about. Firstly, reasonable accommodation for employees. These are specific measures that might make all the difference for people being productive and feeling valued in your company. So it might be if someone has a physical impairment, but is not in a wheelchair, it might be the type of desk they use, the type of chair they use. It might be for someone who is working in an open plan office, perhaps someone with autism, they may need noise cancelling headphones. It could be many different things, and that is on a case-by-case basis. But there's a number of resources available to guide you through reasonable accommodation measures if this is something new to you. And then secondly, thinking about universal design for customers. Now, people often don't think about universal design and accessibility. Companies like Microsoft have been thinking about it in their IT software now for a while. And it does need some resourcing to think about accessibility standards. But then that is a generic approach, which means that everyone can be using your products, using your services. So ideally, I would recommend this budget is managed by senior leadership or your board to help full ownership and communicate the message to staff that it's important. And then the final core element is training. Now, through my work, I've done a lot of training, and when I first thought about this 20 years ago, I commissioned a lot of different projects in many different countries to think about how can you accelerate inclusion of people with disabilities into programming work. And the first thing that we learnt was that training is a really important early step to accelerate progress. If people don't understand about the social model and their place, so everyone has a role and responsibility, it is harder and slower to achieve. So having some kind of starting training for everyone does make a huge difference. And some of the key topics to include are, first of all, addressing conscious and unconscious discriminatory attitudes. I have found that this is actually the most important training subject. And I think, like other attitudes we might hold, for example, about gender, there are many attitudes we carry without being aware of them, often known as unconscious bias. And in effect, what these do is that they are placing discrimination on people with disabilities and having a process that needn't be difficult, but actually quite reflective, and getting people to consider these different models, consider the role of the barriers, consider the social model, can make a huge difference. I'm finding increasingly that most people in my trainings have a family member or a friend or someone they know who is a person with disability who faces these barriers in living their lives, and they tend to welcome going through and understanding some of what disability inclusion according to the social model is about. Another topic is the importance of anti-discrimination and associated laws and regulations. So as I mentioned in those policies, if there's something in your policy about it, it's good that everyone is aware what that is. Things like budgeting in the training, so people are aware that you need to think about budgeting for reasonable accommodation. It can be a really good topic for managers who are recruiting about how to recruit, manage, retain and career develop people with disabilities. And then finally, thinking about accessibility and universal design, which would include increasingly now accessible communications and digital accessibility. So that is a whistle-stop tour through a lot of information about the 4 key elements and the 1 key approach. What I'd like to do is just give you an example of this. So there was a publication that I helped put together a few years ago, and we sought out some case studies. And a company that some of you might be familiar with, Big Basket in India, who are a very large, I think they might be the largest national online groceries provider. And we spoke to them when we were doing this publication, and they told us about their ethos and what they were doing. So first of all, their why. So Big Basket, as I said, is India's largest online grocery store. And I think these numbers are from 2020. At that point, they were stocking over 18,000 products across more than 1,000 brands, delivering to customers nationwide. I expect it's bigger now. And Big Basket pride themselves on selling high quality goods and delivering them on time. So firstly, Big Basket felt that disability inclusion very much fitted their company ethos, which is very strong people-driven values in its business models. And they felt that disability inclusion is a natural part of this. And then the other side was it helped meet its staffing needs. So diversifying their workforce enabled access to a larger talent pool. And when we looked at the numbers that they had available, at that point, they employed 460 staff with disabilities across India, and that represented just over 2% of their total workforce at that time. So that was their why. Then their how was they started by a commitment. It was commitment by their senior management. They expected it to happen. They then thought about the most appropriate areas of their business to start and to increase their staff members. And then when they recruited those people in, they thought about how they could adjust their induction processes for the successful candidates to suit their particular impairment needs. So some examples of this was they gave a longer time frame for the induction. Most staff went through 5 days. A lot of staff took a longer time with disabilities of 12 days. They thought about the content, they thought about user-paced learning, and importantly, they had regular monitoring from a designated link support person in their human resources. This also enabled the next point, which was a careful handover. So the transition from induction to the operation was well supported by their HR managers, who then had ongoing communication and staff to ensure that their impairment and other needs were being met and supported. And this final point on this slide was a really good point that Big Basket thought about when we looked and talked to them about it, which was the social needs. People can often be quite focused on the productive aspects of employees, but employees that are happy feel happy to be part of the company and often are more productive as well. So the social needs consideration, rather than having something separate, to integrate staff with disabilities into all of the company social activities. So they do this regular Fun Fridays for all their staff. And that was also an ongoing mechanism to help remove those barriers that people might have felt between staff with and without disabilities. They all had fun together. It reduced isolation that staff with disabilities can often feel, where they're just kept segregated and separated. And they became friends and got to know each other. And I think as we build social connection, those barriers naturally disappear. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time thinking particularly about neurodiversity. This is a topic that is getting a lot of attention now in different countries and in media, and much more awareness of neurodiversity in every country in the world. So firstly, just to describe a little bit about what it is. And these 5 points that I'll just take you through now give a very brief introduction. So if this is a new topic to you, I would encourage you to go and think about it, maybe read about it a little more. So there's natural human variation in how people think, act, learn, communicate, motivated. And there's many different types of neurodiversity. I've listed some here. They include autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, known commonly as ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, Tourette syndrome. And it's actually quite common for someone who has neurodiversity to have more than one type. A really important point to make is that everyone who is neurodiverse experiences it differently. There are different strengths and challenges that aren't the same for everyone. So it's really important not to make assumptions that because you know and understand one person who is neurodiverse, you understand everyone, because everyone experiences it differently. Getting to know the particular neurodiversity is important. So two of the most known, the most commonly diagnosed conditions within this whole area are people with ADHD, and common traits of that is that people can find it difficult to concentrate on tasks for extended time periods. They can find time management challenging. There can be a hyper focus, and there can be a real strength in creative thinking and lots of energy. And then people with autism affects how people communicate and interact with the world. So people with autism can often be perceived to be quite literal. Anxiety in social situations is quite common. So people can feel a huge amount of internal anxiety when engaging in social situations, and may struggle to read social cues. So the way that social cues are read might be very different. There can be sensory challenges, so things to touch, being affected by bright lights, being affected by noise. Often people with autism prefer consistent routines, and many can often have a very good attention to detail, problem solving and memory, particularly on a topic of interest. So I think the summary I would say to you about neurodiversity inclusion is embrace it well and it will benefit your company. There's a clear business imperative for neurodiversity. It can fuel company innovation. It can help offer good skills matches for roles. It can improve staff retention, because a general point about people with disabilities is when they are in a role that they enjoy and is supported, staff turnover tends to be much lower. They generally, where the research has happened, it shows that people will stay. The key is that they are supported and feel valued and are being supported to do well. Neurodiversity, embracing it, can help show that you value and respect differences, which can benefit the whole of the company culture. Secondly, recognizing that human brains function differently for individuals is good. We all think differently, we're in different ways. There are particular things with neurodiversity, but everyone has their own differences, strengths. It's an opportunity for you to be agile and diversify how your company operates, and it can benefit everyone. A third one, which isn't often talked about but is big, which is people who have neurodiversity can often fear stigmatization and lack of understanding, which actually prevents their diagnosis and effective support. So one thing I would suggest is that if you don't think you have any people with neurodiversity in your company, that may be a false assumption, because sometimes people don't seek diagnosis because they are fearing that they will be labelled, that they will be stigmatized. And finally, many workplaces have not traditionally, and many do not currently, operate in ways that neurodiverse people can thrive. There are key strengths. that will benefit everyone, actually. Things like more structure, more planning. There's many different ways, which I think we might touch on at some point. So some ideas to start your thinking about neurodiversity inclusion, some practical ideas for you. I think there'll be more, but I didn't want to give a comprehensive list because it's good for people to think about their own context. So firstly, let's think about recruitment and HR management. Having flexible interview protocols, providing questions in advance on request. Now, sometimes people might think that this is, they don't like to give questions. They like to see spontaneous responses, but actually it's not designed for many people, including people who are quite introverted and reflectors. Having some time to think about it gives more of their truer answer of what they would be like as an employee for you, rather than just giving a question at an interview. Supporting employees to understand strengths and potential to develop their skills in your company. Accessible and inclusive workplaces. So, for example, low sensory arousal spaces, if you have a big open plan office, can help support emotional and attentional regulation. Things like workplace temperature, if it's too hot or too cold, that sensory challenge that people can have. It may also affect other people who are quite temperature sensitive. Encouraging staff to be neurodiverse aware in training can make a difference. A big one that I already mentioned in one of the key elements is funding support for reasonable accommodation. So examples here would be noise cancelling headphones, assistive technologies. Thinking about your company culture of how you do meetings. Have some planning with some structured meetings and resources pre-available for consideration. Regular breaks. I do my training now in a way that I have regular breaks because that's good practice for disability inclusion of many different impairment types. And what I find is that everyone enjoys the training more. When they have regular breaks, they have a time to take a time out and then come back to the training. Maybe give people the choice of standing or sitting in meetings. And also a really important one is people feel psychologically safe to ask questions. It definitely benefits everyone, but often people feel nervous that there might be a negative impact if they ask certain questions, so they don't get asked. Thinking about disclosure and support channels specifically. And then finally, thinking about teams. Teams have all different personalities, cultures, and thinking about how diverse personalities can be embraced for innovative company thinking and practice might really help unlock some of your business potential. So a few examples here. Advertising to more customers. So a UK company, a global advertising company, partnered with a UK foundation on ADHD to adopt neurodiverse friendly approaches to their advertising to reach more customers. It can help with the staff retention and satisfaction. So B&Q, which is a DIY chain in the UK, it has gained benefits of increased overall employee satisfaction and better retention and productivity when staff are supported and accommodated to succeed. And actually, I know someone who works at B&Q in the UK that in a different situation may have remained unemployed, but has been a very, very good shop floor worker for B&Q for many years now. There's an example in the UK of a civil engineering company that decided within a big open plan office to create a low arousal space so people could go take time out, do some quiet reading. It helps support their emotional and attentional regulation. Big open plan offices can be quite noisy and distracting. And then a tech company provided equipment to encourage colleagues to be physically active. So if people are quite high energy, they don't maybe settle as much to what they're thinking, but if they can continue to be physically active whilst they're focusing on other things, that can make a big difference. So finally, I just wanted to provide a few resources for you of where you might look and read for further information. So a reasonable amount of what I've presented today has come from this publication that I've mentioned a couple of times, Disability Inclusion Guidance for Companies. And I've given 2 links here, one for a copy in a booklet, a PDF, and then they also, CDC published an accessible version. And then secondly, the International Labour Organization has a global business and disability network. And that website has a huge range of information, resources, and contacts. So I've given a link there. And then specifically, they have a section on their website which gives links to different countries, which outlines legislation, companies working on this, links with people with disabilities, OPD. So you might find that very interesting for your country, wherever you're based. And then on neurodiversity, there are 2 resources here that if you haven't got a resource that you know about, these are both from the UK. One is produced by ACAS, and it's a website on understanding neurodiversity at work. And then the second one is produced by the UK ADHD Foundation on an information guide for employers. So there's a variety of information and topics and ideas in there, in addition to what I've presented today. So I've presented a huge amount of information. I hope I haven't overwhelmed you as listeners listening to this today, but I hope that's been a useful introduction for you. So thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Sue Coe. It was really inspiring and interesting, all the theoretical and practical background from the world and the UK, and how these inclusive practices drive innovation, enhance productivity, and bring more justice. And me, myself, was also a very sensitive person to light and noises. I always put my noise cancelers in Tokyo trains. It really saves my life, and it's a big thing I know for even in the workplace. Okay, we hope that our audience will be motivated and benefit from your presentation too. Now, let me start the question and answer session for more in-depth understanding of the topic. And my first question is about you and your professional motivation. Like, I wonder what inspired you to become an advocate for disability inclusion, and how has that shaped your career?
Yeah, so I never thought when I started my working life, which was in the late 1980s, I did a degree in politics and economics and philosophy at Oxford University. And I started working in international development with a big NGO called World Vision when I left. And I worked on general mainstream issues. And then I went to another job where one of my colleagues, so it was basically through people I knew, one of my colleagues had a visual impairment, but I noticed that she was trying to not ask for any help. She was a brilliant employee. And she was trying to sort out some of her own accommodation issues, but it was actually holding back her own skill base. She was amazing. So I worked in this team where we worked on accommodating around visual impairment issues for about 6 years. Then I moved on to another job where I worked overseas and had a colleague who was deaf. Again, one of the best people I've ever worked with. But it was about how can we accommodate as a team, what role do all of us have to bring out the most in each other. So I really learned through their own personal struggles in the workplace, what it felt like for them, and also the importance that all of us work together to bring out our own productivity and potential. And so I learned sign language at that time, which led me to working with a deaf charity in the UK for 2 years when I came back from overseas, managing their sign language training program. And I realized then in development that most people don't think about disability inclusion or perceive it as an issue where, oh, that's not my issue. That's not something that's relevant to us. But as I explained, it is. And so I've gained increasing passion, and I worked for 6 years as a disability advisor back at World Vision about 20 years ago now. And I had some grant money to actually go out across the world and set up some projects to see what worked to advance this. And I've taken it from there. I've been a consultant now for over a decade, and I love to, it's a real passion I have to kind of help be a bridge of enabling everyone to fulfill their potential. And there are many benefits, as I said, for being disability inclusive.
Thank you so much. Very interesting and very sensitive of you. And thanks for answering. And my second question is about the common challenges, like organizations. We talked about how they can integrate this, but the challenges they face when fostering an inclusive workplace, and how can these challenges can be effectively overcome?
Yeah. I think if I summarize it, because I've given quite a long presentation, I would say mindset. The thing to think about mainly is the mindset of the company. So this is where senior leaders really makes a difference. Listening to people with disabilities, but at the same time, one of the common challenges that many people with disabilities going into workplace face is that they feel they have to do all their own advocacy. So actually taking a lead of thinking about what do we need to do for reasonable accommodation, how can we adapt it for an individual, but generally become more aware about being an accessible workplace. And so the place of universal accessibility, you know, do you have a meeting room in your office that is accessible to someone who is in a wheelchair? Does it have a linked accessible toilet and refreshment area? And sometimes people don't think about lifts. So that's thinking about physical impairments. But some of the challenges are thinking about mindset, but also thinking about reasonable accommodation and accessibility. And I would encourage people to engage with people with disabilities as well to overcome them.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you. Thank you so much. And you also talked about neurodiversity, very interesting and trending topic, as we mentioned. And so embracing neurodiversity, how can it contribute to innovation, not only inclusion, but also how it contributes to innovation and creative problem solving within a business?
Yeah. So, I mean, it starts from the place of thinking that we all have different strengths and we all have different ways that we see the world. And there can be, although I don't want to be stereotypical because different people have different types of neurodiversity, it's starting from the place that recognizing everyone has strengths and gifts, everyone sees things differently. Typically, people with autism and sometimes with ADHD, they'll really think through a problem to a logical, so they'll say they see a gap for a new market or a new problem, and they'll think very logically through with coming up with some ideas that people may not have thought about before. Giving critical feedback on things being tried, whether it works or doesn't work, can really be a strength as well. And also in terms of moving through to delivery, a strong logical and practical focus can also be another area there. And this thing about many people seeing new issues to be solved that people have never thought about before. So one example I give, I think actually most of the car mechanics I think I've ever used for my car have possibly had autism, I suspect, but they are brilliant car mechanics, and they see and diagnose issues and come up with ideas. Just in terms of having my car serviced for many years, that's one particular example. But the key thing is to have the environment where it is possible to bring out that creativity, that problem solving, and that people feel safe to give that feedback in a way that is seen as positive critical feedback, not negative critical feedback as well.
True. Yeah, that's very true. Thank you so much. And my fourth question is, let's say the company decided to build an inclusive environment, and your top piece of advice, what would it be for such companies?
Oh, so getting it down to one piece is hard. But if I'm allowed to maybe have two. I would say the top one I would say is this mindset. So think about the mindset led from the top. Make it an important thing that everyone thinks is part of what we do. And then if you need to think about a lead issue to think about, I would say reasonable accommodation. So HR will be really important lead role because companies are a collection of individuals at the end of it. I know there are policies and practice, but we all work together. So if all of us understand that it is important for everyone to feel included and there is practical, reasonable accommodation with a budget available that enables people to come in and to work well, that would be a really good starting point.
Thank you so much for this advice. And my last question, Mrs. Sue. So, you know, we are in a rapid change era, and looking ahead with all these developments of AI and quick learning of, you know, with all these technologies, what trends do you foresee in this realm of disability inclusion and neurodiversity? And how can organizations best prepare for these changes?
Yeah, so the world is changing a lot, isn't it? But I think one of the biggest trend is greater awareness of the diversity of people in every country, especially neurodiversity. I think although the pandemic was a very challenging time, it started companies to think more flexibly about flexible working arrangements, flexible locations, which benefited everyone. So even people with childcare responsibilities or responsibilities for aging parents, having a more flexible workplace helps. Remote working can help. So technologies, there's been a huge advance in disability and neurodiversity inclusion in technology and accessibility. So there are some of those trends. So thinking about technology trends and how it can benefit you. But I think the main thing is that this is a growing, increasing trend. And people are becoming increasingly aware that if you don't think about including people with disabilities in workplaces, then the whole of society is worse off. It's important to think about how can we, as productive societies, include everyone in our employee base.
Thank you so much. So, Mrs. Su, thank you for joining us today. And I'm sure that our viewers enjoyed and were definitely inspired by your presentation. So, before closing our P-Talk, I would like to thank our viewers once again and hope that you will continue watching us. See you in the next P-Talk, and goodbye for now.